How do, and welcome back. Well, today's the day when I taste my wild yeast ale. This was brewed, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. 4.5 or about 5 litres, 1 gallon of ale as an experiment because I was using the yeast that I caught from my back garden. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've tried a bottle because I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to make me ill or anything like that. And I can assure you it doesn't. But what does it taste like? That's what we're going to find out today. So let's get this open and yeah, let's see if my wild yeast makes a good beer. I'm going to use exactly the same glass that I did for the Saison, the raw Saison, and that's because it was the same malt. I brewed 10 litres and then I just divided the malt between the raw Saison and this wild yeast pale ale. So I thought it would be interesting to use the same glass so that we can look at the head retention, because if you remember, that raw Saison, it had a head that came down to here and it was thick and it was creamy. Is this going to be the same? Because this, don't forget, has been boiled. The raw Saison was just kept at 80 degrees for about half an hour. This was boiled for half an hour. Does it make a difference? Let's find out. So I'm just going to open this bottle and we'll see what we have. Oh, a nice CO2 there. This. There's a little bit of smoke, not as much with the Saison, but then I think that's to do with the yeast. I think the Saison, it is a yeast that just creates a lot of CO2 and carbonation. Oh, yeah, hop. More hop on this. More hop than malt, I would say. It's been in the fridge for, oh, look at that. It's been in the fridge for about 3 hours. And I think that's probably maybe a bit too long. The one I had before had about, 2 fingers worth of head. This is just a wispy little head on the top. But still, that's interesting. The last beer I had, I only chilled for about an hour or so, and I got these 2 fingers. And this is just a little cap on the top of the beer. Pretty much like what you see in a lot of commercial beers, lagers especially. But it's exactly the same malt. So I may have over chilled this one. Okay. But even when it was chilled for just an hour or so, I was only still getting 2 fingers of head. It wasn't coming all the way down here like with the raw Saison. Now, of course, some of that can be to do with the level of carbonation. I understand that. But it also begs the question, when we boil for, well, this was boiled for half an hour, but usually you'll boil for 1 hour, sometimes 1.5 hours. Are we actually boiling away some protein? Because protein adds to the characteristic of the head retention. Are we boiling some of that away? That's a question that I'm asking, and I think probably we are, because even when in the other beer that I tried, and I had the 2 fingers of head, it wasn't as compact, it wasn't as tight, it wasn't as creamy as on the raw Saison. The beer that wasn't boiled just held at 80 degrees for half an hour. Okay, I'm going to dive in. It's pretty chilled, but we'll give it a go. All the same, I don't know what I'll be able to taste. Oh, I can taste a lot. Ooh. Hops, hops, hops. I think I put Galaxy in this. I should have looked through my notes. I think I put Galaxy in this, and you're definitely getting a really nice tropical fruit flavours. There's a little bit of grapefruit in there as well. Nice bitterness on the back end. But here's another thing that I think is really interesting. The malt profile is much, much quieter than in the raw saison. And don't forget, this is exactly the same wort. And in fact, you could argue, yeah, this is actually being chilled for the same amount of time. So the raw saison I had chilling for I think about a couple of hours. This has only had 1 more hour extra. But yeah, look at the difference in the head, and also the malt flavour is just really quiet. It's there, a little bit of caramel, a little bit of biscuitiness, but it's very much quiet. It's much more subdued than in the raw beer. And that makes me think as well, are we boiling away flavour as well as proteins when we do the 1 hour boils, the 1.5 hour boils? Are we actually boiling away some of that maltiness? But here's what I find the most interesting. Are we ready? I cannot taste the yeast. It's not there. Now, when I started this experiment, I was reading up on wild yeast. And they say very often with wild yeast, you can get these funky flavours. You can get fruity flavours, banana-y flavours. There is no yeastiness to this beer. There's no yeast flavours at all. It's a completely neutral yeast from my back garden. That is a really nice beer. Putting aside the comparison with the saison, which is a different beer altogether, but putting that aside, just looking and tasting this beer, it's really nice. it's yeah, I don't know what to say. Yeast, wild yeast from my garden, and it ferments beautifully and cleanly a beer. Now, will I use this yeast all the time? Because of course I save the yeast from the fermenter. No, because sometimes you do want that yeastiness in the beer, depending on the style of beer that you're making. Some styles do want that sort of fruitiness or that banana-iness that the yeast esters give. But if I want to make a beer where I'm really not interested in the yeast, I just want a nice mix of malts and hops, this is perfect, because it just sits in the background and you don't even know it's there. It's completely flavourless, clean fermenting from my garden. So if you're a home brewer, I challenge you. Go out and capture some yeast from your garden. Brew a beer. Start with a small batch like I've done, about 4.5 litres, 5 litres. Just brew a small batch using just dry malt extract, keep it cheap, and see what you can get. Because from my experience, and it's only this experience, but from my experience, you capture a really nice beer fermenting yeast, a brewer's yeast from your garden. For free. All you have to do is make a quick starter. Well, not starter, it's just 300 mils of water in a mason jar. dissolve into that 30 grams of a light dry malt. So it's that 10% ratio. So 300 mils of water, 30 grams of a light dry malt, put it in a mason jar, and then all I used was a hop sock. So I have the mason jar and I just put the hop sock over the top and then folded it up so it sat on top like a lid. And then just put it outside in your garden, preferably under a fruit tree. I did. We have a cherry tree outside, so I just put it underneath the cherry tree or wherever there's foliage, flowers, that sort of thing. And I just left it there for 24 hours. Actually, it was a bit over, I think. I think I left it for about 26, 27. Bring it indoors. Take off the hop sock, of course. Or you can use a cheesecloth. Cut a square of cheesecloth and use a rubber band, put that on the top. It's really just to stop the bugs getting in. That's all it's for. And then I put the lid on, I tightened it down, and then I just unscrewed it until it was loose. Put it in a dark place, warm dark place, and just left it. And after about a day or two, it started fermenting. That was my starter, basically. I then brewed a beer, and I poured that into the beer. This is what we have. Beautiful. So yeah, if you're a home brewer, give it a go. You might get a really nice funky Belgian-y style yeast. You may get a completely neutral yeast like I have. You may get something in between. But you don't know unless you try. And it's easy and it's cheap. And then once, of course, you've brewed with the yeast and you've determined this is a nice brewing yeast, just take out from the fermenter the sediment, which is what I've done. Then you let it just sit and let it separate, decant into another mason jar, screw the lid on, put it in the fridge, and it's good for about a month or two. So I'm definitely going to be brewing with this yeast again. Why not? Why not? Why spend? I know yeast doesn't cost a lot, but why spend it when you've got it for free in your garden? Wow, what a nice beer. But it does raise a question, doesn't it? Are we actually boiling off flavour? Are we boiling off proteins when we boil, when we brew? Interesting question. In fact, what I'm thinking of doing is another experiment with this yeast. Like I've said, it's very clean tasting, but is that because I brewed it, or it fermented, sorry, at cold temperature, which was also surprising to me. So I left it out here. I forgot about it. Oops, I forgot about it and I left it out here, the fermenter. And the next morning I came downstairs and I came in to the brew corner, and I think I've mentioned this in a previous video, and it was going mental. It was really fermenting, even though it had been about 12, 14 degrees that night. I left it here for a week and then I took it indoors for a week because I was going on holiday. So it had a week, sorry about that, it's carbonated. So it had a week at about 14 degrees and then it had a week at about 20 degrees. But what I'm thinking is, it's that 14 degrees where it did all the fermentation. It was finished after a week. Is it because of the low temperatures it never produced any esters, any flavours? So what I'm thinking of doing for the next beer is again just making a small batch, about 10 litres, but then split it into two, just like I did before with the Saison and this one. But one I'll ferment out here for a week and then take it indoors again. So exactly the same, which should produce the same results. But the other I will ferment indoors. so it will be at about 20-21 degrees throughout the fermentation. And what I'm thinking is this ferments very well at low temperatures. How does it ferment at higher temperatures? Is that those higher temperatures going to stress the yeast? And when you stress yeast, it tends to give off all of these sort of flavours. So that's what I'm thinking of doing for the next beer, is actually do another experiment using the same yeast that I captured from the bottom of the fermenter, and it's now in my fridge. But one batch I will ferment just as I did with this, low temperatures, and the other batch warm temperature throughout, and see if it stresses the yeast, see it gives off any fruitiness, any banana-iness, any funkiness, and just see. But yeah, this was fermented at about 14 degrees and it's completely clean. And the flavour, you know, the beer itself, when you're tasting it, it's just completely clean and very crisp, a nice crispness to it. So yes, absolutely thumbs up success with my wild yeast experiment. That's 2 experiments that have both come out absolutely bang on. The raw saison, beautiful, and the wild yeast, what a tasty beer. So thanks for watching. It's been a pleasure. If you're a home brewer, and I know home brewers watch this, there's a couple of home brewers, I know you do, here's a challenge. Try and capture some yeast from your garden, make a beer, put it on YouTube. Let's see what your results are. But I'm really happy with that. Again, like with the saison, it's just a shame there's only 7 bottles, well 6, actually no, because I've had one before. There's only about 4 or 5 bottles left. Okay, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you again in the next video. Bye bye for now.